So let's talk about trying to kill every unit in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today we're talking about some of the common themes to do with deleting units efficiently when trying to remove your opponent's models from the board. Obviously exactly how every army tries to get the job done will vary a lot depending on the actual codex, but there's quite a lot of common themes and common counters that you can use to plenty of units, and I thought we'd talk about that a bit in this video. First up, I thought we'd talk generally about efficient weapon choices and choosing the right tools for the job to counter any one given unit, some of the most common defensive barriers and rules to stop you from destroying enemy units, then a little bit of discussion around killing units in melee, reaching enemy hidden units out of line of sight, and dealing with some of the biggest, baddest and toughest models in the game. Plenty to talk about it, so let's jump straight in. In general, I think that 9th edition 40k generally does a bit better than some of the previous editions of the game in making you really have to pick the right tool for the job with your weapons. There are some units that are just so efficient that they're going to be good against most things, but it's generally going to be more efficient to use certain weapons to kill light infantry, some to kill heavy infantry, and some to kill vehicles and tanks. Obviously you have to choose your weapons before you know your opponent's exact list, so hopefully your army is going to be able to kill all those 3 types of targets, and will have to be at least somewhat balanced. If you're going to a competitive tournament, or even just playing regular games in your club though, you can certainly tailor your selections to the meta a bit. Say if loads of people are playing Admech and Drukhari around, you might want some tools that are very good at killing Drukhari raiders, or maybe some options that can efficiently counter Skitarii infantry, or 2 wound Space Marines if you see a lot of them. The weapon strength versus toughness chart is usually going to be one of the most important things when dealing efficient damage to a unit. Generally you pay more points for higher strength weapons, and across the vast majority of in-game choices, the most efficient weapons will usually be the weapons that just wound the enemy on a 3+. So say if you're attacking toughness 3 targets, strength 4 weapons are likely to be some of the best. The same with toughness 7 vehicles, things that just nose into wounding them on 3s like strength 8 dark lances or strength 9 las cannons. If you were able to pick your weapon selections in a vacuum, they would be the best options. Wounding on 4s or even 5s can still be very viable, but usually the extra investment to get the strength is typically worth it to get up to a 3+. And of course bonus points if you're firing at something that you can wound on a 2. I think at least most of the time strength 8 weapons aren't going to be enormously efficient against toughness 4 targets, although of course they will wound them easily. But there's quite a lot of things that can throw out quite a lot of strength 6 attacks, which is quite relevant with things like Admech and Drukhari around for wounding their quite valuable toughness 3 infantry on 2s. The other side of the story is of course AP, and as a rough rule of thumb, I'd usually want to aim to have enough AP to reduce the enemy's save down to a 5+ or worse, or just reduce them down to their invul save if they happen to have one of those. Basically, the further you reduce your opponent's save, the less it matters proportionally. For example, your squad firing at a 2+ save target will get literally double the damage through if you can reduce them down to a 3+ save, so it's really important to have at least some AP. But say if you're making the difference between a 5+ save and a 6+ save, that's only an extra 25% increase in the damage output, nowhere near as important. I'd say almost always across the board in 40k, if you want to have the direct counter for a weapon to a unit, just fire a weapon at them that's 1 strength higher than their toughness, and has enough AP to have them saving on a 5+ or worse. If you can allocate your weapons to be able to do that consistently within a game, so say fire your anti-infantry weapons at the infantry and anti-tank weapons at the tanks, then you're likely to convert into a lot of damage across the whole of your army. Stratagems can sometimes add a little bit of flexibility to help with that. Sometimes you might be able to get a +1 to wound to make some lighter weapons punch up a lot harder against tough targets, or maybe get a bit of extra AP somehow so your light weapons can be more relevant against high save targets. Of course, just having the right strength and AP isn't the end of the story. Your weapons must also be efficient in their own right as well. Some units and guns are just more efficient than others in 40k, and just because it happens to counteract the right units properly doesn't necessarily mean that it's always still going to be the best choice. You still might be better off with a unit that doesn't have the exact most efficient profile if it is just ludicrously strong in its own right. Just for a few examples of some efficient weapons against some common units, here are a few units and some weapons that fairly easily counter them. Imperial Guardsmen with toughness 3 and a 5+ save will not like being hit by bolt rifles with strength 4 and AP -1. Space Marines with 2 wounds and a 3+ armor save won't like getting hit by overcharged plasma or Grey Knight Force swords with a decent strength, high AP and damage 2. Perhaps that's something I should have mentioned on the previous slide as well. Having the right amount of damage to kill them very neatly with the exact damage criteria for the unit you're targeting is also pretty nice if you can get it. Gravis Marines won't like anything that's flat 3 damage, particularly things like the Redemptor Dreadnought's overcharged plasma incinerator. Strength 9, great AP and flat 3 damage will kill them dead. Autocannons will generally have a good time against Drukhari raiders, generally outperforming las cannons thanks to their good invul save, and predator tanks and most armor in general will just like really quite high strength things with good AP and good damage. Say Dark Lances or Admech Cognis las cannons are both pretty solid choices. Just going a little bit more generalized for unit types, light infantry such as guardsmen will generally want low AP, damage 1 weapons, and morale might actually do a little bit of work for you if you are inflicting some fairly large casualties. Heavy infantry like terminators will ideally want multi-damage and some AP. The weapons can easily be mid-strength ones like strength 5 or strength 6. You ideally want to match the wounds characteristic with the damage characteristic of your own weapons, and when the squad starts to become a little bit damaged, you might be able to prioritize shooting certain weapons before others. Say if you were firing at a Terminator squad and one's on 1 wound, it might make more sense to fire all your damage 1 weapons first in the hope that you plink off that Terminator, and then any higher damage weapons can go into the next one. For vehicles and hard targets, you generally want high strength, high AP and high damage weapons. Typically when targeting them, I'd want to fire big swingy weapons first, ones that might easily go through and cause mass damage, or potentially nothing at all if you roll poorly. Hopefully whittle them down, and then when they have a few wounds left you want to finish them off with something a bit more reliable. Maybe even a flurry of small arms or mid-strength shooting, something that's quite likely to chip off 1 or 2 wounds and guarantee the tank's death, so your next big swingy weapons can go into the next heavy vehicles. With tanks and heavy targets though, I would generally try and make sure that you're going to be finishing off each tank. It's not usually a good idea to leave lots of vehicles slightly injured but not actually destroyed, as then your opponent will be able to use them all next turn. Generally it's better just to destroy 1 vehicle and leave 1 untouched, compared with just damaging and maybe bracketing a couple. Finally, characters can often make themselves a little bit tricky to take out. They'll almost always be screened behind enemy squads or vehicles, meaning it's just often not practical to try and take them out first. You can invest in sniper weapons, though I'd argue that quite a lot of the options throughout 9th edition aren't particularly great. Maybe squads like Space Marine Eliminators might be some of the most efficient sniper weapons in the game right now. Even if you do go all in on those though, you still might be countered by certain bodyguard units, or if it's really critical that the opponent keeps their character alive, they can always just hide them out of line of sight behind terrain. In general, I try and be a bit opportunistic as to trying to snipe characters. Maybe if they're in a compromising position, you might be able to try and whittle down a squad that was protecting them to less than 3 models, and then perhaps try and cheekily snipe the character with a high strength and high damage weapon, something that's going to deal a whole ton of wounds. Otherwise, you might just be best off focusing on the things that they're buffing, maybe trying to kill them opportunistically in close combat if you can. Though if you are engaging them in combat, you generally want to be making sure that they are dead, as if you even leave them alive on just 1 wound remaining, they'll still be striking you back with their full characteristics at full force. Certain barriers to damage seem to be becoming more and more prevalent in 9th edition 40k as well. Lots of things don't just have their standard save and wounds characteristic these days. We're seeing plenty of proliferation of -1 damage mechanics, feel no pain type saves, and sometimes things like modifiers like -1 to hit. -1 damage really does seem to be quite a big feature of 9th edition though. Things like the new Death Guard Disgustingly Resilient special rule, Duty Eternal on Dreadnoughts, or Ramshackle vehicles, there really are quite a lot of examples out there. Generally -1 damage makes your damage 2 weapons about as bad as they can be. It literally cuts their damage output in half, so you're usually best off using either damage 1 weapons, mortal wounds, or very high damage weapons such as damage d6 weapons or better, as they'll be feeling the effects far less proportionately. Feel no pain saves, like ignoring wounds on a 6+ or 5+, are also relatively common. Things like Space Marine Apothecaries, Homunculus Coven units in Drakari, and Orc Pain Boys. For big hard targets with a whole ton of wounds, they essentially function very similarly to just having extra wounds on your datasheet, but ones that are a bit swingy as to whether or not you make those rolls or not. Perhaps the place where feel no pain type saves are the most annoying are on multi-wound infantry, as it kind of gets in the way of neatly killing them with a damage profile equal to their wounds characteristic. Say if you had a 5+ feel no pain type save on a standard Space Marine and you hit them with a damage 2 weapon, your opponent's actually more likely than not to ignore at least one of those wounds and mean that you have to dedicate yet another shot to that same model. It means there's a fair bit more value in shooting a unit with a damage characteristic that's just 1 higher than their wounds characteristic. Say for example hitting that same Space Marine squad with a Thunderhammer, that makes it far more unlikely that they're going to make 2 of those feel no pain type saves, and she'll be a lot better at guaranteeing the death of each model. There's also things like -1 to hit special rules, such as Dense Cover, Flyers, or Drakari Venoms. Generally -1 to hit will hurt armies with a lower ballistic skill much worse than higher ballistic skill ones, so if you do have any units that hit on 3s or 2s, they might be best at dealing with those, or you might be able to engage them in melee with something or other, as a lot of the -1 to hit penalties will typically only affect ranged weapons. Some armies are just spectacularly hardy with high saves, high toughness and high invul saves, We'll talk a bit more about big bad units later, but if you can buffer them or reduce or diminish their invul saves by any way in your codex, that could be an option. Otherwise, mortal wounds are likely to be quite good value here. If you're getting all that durability, you're quite likely to have a high points cost per wound, so each wound chipped away with a mortal wound is likely to be good value. Some units just really are just all-round durable though, say for example Mortarion, or even just models with a fairly low points cost that have a ton of wounds and good barriers, for example the Demon Beasts of Nurgle. Obviously there are going to be some weapons that are more efficient at killing them than others, but durability is just something that they're going to do well, and they're not going to go down to much more than a massive amount of focused fire. Finally, and one that I didn't mention on the slide, was transhuman physiology type mechanics. For example, you can't wound this unit on anything less than a 4+. That can often mean that lower strength weapons are a bit more relatively valuable against them, as they're going to do just as well as high strength weapons at wounding the targets, and also anything that has a reroll to wound built in. Perhaps Space Marine Lightning Claws are one of the best examples right now. You could still be wounding a transhuman physiology toughness 4 unit 3 out of 4 times if you have a full reroll to wound that the Lightning Claws give you. Finally, let's move on to talking about a few specific examples, killing things in combat, killing hidden units, and dealing with enormous threatening units that you might not be able to kill efficiently. First up, killing things in melee is often one of the most efficient ways that you can get damage done in 40k. Obviously it's trickier to deliver melee units to their targets, and they might have to go through other barriers like making the charge, getting through Overwatch, and getting hit back by the enemy. But for that reward, you'll usually get a far higher damage output than you could ever do in shooting. If the enemy unit's not very combat capable, then it's easy enough to do the damage without them striking back too hard, but trying to take more combat capable enemies on in melee can just be a bit more worrying. Even if you do manage to get the charge, which of course will be ideal, you need to make sure that you're not going to get hit back too hard and just lose your charging unit or a big chunk of them. So hopefully you want to kill either all of them or most of them before they get the chance to fight back. You have to weigh up roughly how many models you'll reliably destroy to be able to decide whether you're making the charge or not. Potentially think about thinning them down with shooting or something first if you think that your combat capable unit isn't quite going to make it, and then hopefully kill enough of them when you do charge that the counterpunch isn't going to do you too much damage. Fight's last mechanics could also help with that if you do have one available in your army. If you can make the enemy unit fight after everyone else, you might be able to dogpile them with multiple strong units on your side and hopefully have the combined effect be enough to bring them down. In general though, just as some things are easier to charge to death than shoot to death, some things are going to be easier to shoot to death than charge. Say for example the Necron Silent King with his Fight's Last aura, meaning that he's usually going to be able to hit you before you hit him. Or say things like Drakari Witches, who get a 4+ invul save in close combat, but not to shooting, where they're just ridiculously fragile and will die to a little bit of light infantry fire. Just one of the many reasons why it's good to have a little bit of combat and range in most armies. Often in 9th edition, whether or not you're able to remove some chaff troops at the back of the board can be the difference between winning on the mission game or losing it, and these units are sometimes at least relatively fragile if you do manage to get hits on them. They could also be damage dealers moving up the board, protected by cover, relatively fragile if they're exposed, but great value to you if you can kill them before they get to hit you. One of the most obvious ways is to fire things like artillery at them, ignores line of sight weapons such as Tau Smart missile weapons, Orc Squig Buggies or Imperial Guard Manticores could often have really quite a lot of good returns. Ignores line of sight weapons in 9th tend to be charged at quite a decent premium, but having an element of them in your army could really yield mission rewards far beyond the actual kills, or might be able to put some hurt down on enemy units that are really fragile but are likely to mess up a good chunk of your army if you can't deal with them. Not every faction has ignores line of sight guns that I deem adequate though. Other options include fast movers such as flyers or bikers to get round the terrain and get line of sight on them. Maybe things like deep strikers or strategic reserves can come in from the side of the board and hopefully take out some key units, or potentially long-reaching fast melee units of your own. Say for example bikers that can advance and charge and maybe get crazy amounts of distance across the board. Maybe White Scars or Drakari could be a good example of that. Finally, let's talk about the biggest, nastiest and toughest threats around. Things maybe that most armies might struggle to deal with somewhat. Primarchs like Mortarion or Guilliman. Units that can only take a certain amount of damage per turn like the Nightbringer. Maybe Be'lakor from the Chaos Demons. Or big Death Stars of slow movers like Bullgrin or Deathwing. A lot of these could really be horrendous to put down for the points, depending on what weapons you have available. Generally, if the opponent has made a massive commitment to one enormous threatening unit, I'd advise trying to make a conscious decision fairly early on. Do they need to be dealt with as soon as possible? And if so, will you be able to deal with them with the tools that you have available? If the answer to either one of those is no, then legitimately the best way of dealing with them might just be to ignore them completely, dedicate almost no firepower their way, and focus on the mission and the rest of their army. Otherwise, if they absolutely need to get brought down, it's time to focus fire. If you are going down the ignoring them type route, the challenge is mainly about letting them not do enough damage to justify the enormous investment that the opponent has placed in them. A lot of these will do massive damage in close combat, though not that much at range, so it's quite easy to see what sort of threat range they'd have on the board and make sure that the only things that they can charge are things that aren't really all that valuable, or might leave them out of position the next turn. Mortarion won't be too happy if all he can catch is a squad of guardsmen each turn. He's not going to make up his investment that way. For some of these, you might be able to move block them, debuff their movement, or tar pit them, again stopping them getting to the heart of your army where they really want to be. If they don't have fly, you might be able to physically block them with chaff on the ground. Keeping them out of the fight even for one turn could well be worth it. Some of them are also really quite good against killing heavy hitters, but might not be crazily efficient against hordes of chaff, or lots of things like swarms with loads of wounds but not really good saves, so that might be a way to keep them tied up for a turn, fighting very low value units. While all this is going on, I'd try and focus on killing the rest of their army. Make the most efficient use of your firepower to delete everything else that they have, ideally. Even if their big nasty threat is completely untouched at the end of the game, they're still likely going to be losing if it is the only model left on the tabletop. That often seems to be the case when a Space Marine player with Guilliman loses. He'll be the last model left on the table, but there's only so much that he can do all by himself. While doing that, just really focus on playing the mission, sacrifice your units for objectives where they matter and not where they don't, hoover up all your secondaries, and try and deny your opponent as many of theirs as possible. I'm still not saying that you can't try and damage the big threat. You can still put any firepower into them that doesn't have any better place to be going, or maybe even just shoot them with any guns that are massively efficient against them, in the hopes that you do enough to be able to bring them down later in the game. In general though, I think you don't want to go half-half, make significant commitments to trying to kill them, but not doing enough to actually bring them down. That's just going to be the worst of both worlds. If you are going all in to kill one of these big nasties though, anything that can give you a whole army buff or debuff against the target will generally be great. Say Cadians with their overlapping fields of fire for army-wide +1 to hit if you're going to focus them, or the tried and tested Eldar combination of Doom and Jinx, perhaps removing Invuls with Null Zone or Death Hex if you're playing Space Marines or Chaos. I'd try and be realistic as to whether or not you're going to bring them down by the end of this turn and plan around that. You might be able to shoot enough firepower to try and bring them to a level where one of your combat units could finish them off, or just accept that this isn't going to be the turn that you kill them, do as much damage as you possibly can, but don't go for something like a half-hearted charge where you damage them and then just have your scary melee unit deleted in return. Generally, mortal wounds are usually going to be your friend against any of these. They'll be fairly efficient at overcoming some of the strong saves and barriers that they have in place, and they might help out with the need to do damage in multiple phases. That's going to be particularly relevant against things like Ghazghkull or Catan shards. A lot of the time you will be able to line up for a fairly optimal turn of damage dealing against these guys. They need to come to you, otherwise they're not going to make back their investment, so hopefully you should be able to line up as much of your army's damage dealing as possible to drown them in a bunch of shooting and then maybe finish them off with a charge. So anyway, I hope that's been at least a little bit of help in bringing down units in 40k. Generally it boils down to choosing the right tool for the job, bypassing or negating the barriers to doing your damage when you need to, making sure that you commit properly to destroying a unit when you need to and don't when you don't, and using any melee that you have effectively to finish things off without getting your own models killed in your turn. As always, let me know if you have any further insights down in the comments below. What are the units that you might struggle to kill most in the game, and have you found any interesting solutions to bringing them down? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. There'll be new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I'd just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and again you can find that down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.